Welcome to part 2 of our Overlanding box series. Today we're talking about trim work and fiberglassing. If you missed part 1, I'd highly recommend you start there. It's the foundation of this box and what leads us to where we're at right now. If you missed part 1, I'll link it down below. But if you're all caught up, let's get started. Welcome to Maker's Revival. In part 1, we built the foundation of the box. So today we'll be talking about how we trim that box out for the gaskets, for the latching mechanisms, for the hinges, and how we attach it to the roof of the car. Where we left off last time are those boxes you can see in the background with the chamfered edges. And so what I'm doing now is just preparing some of the raw material to apply to these boxes as the trim work for eventually what will be the gaskets. And I'm just cutting this down to 2 inches wide at the moment. My intent was to apply these to the boxes and then cut the lids off afterward, but I realized that the boxes would be unstable passing across the table saw with these on the edges. So instead I'll cut these down to 1 inch wide pieces and apply them after the lids of the boxes are cut off. So I'm going to continue cutting down material for the trim work of this box. And don't worry, I will show you the full lineup at the end of everything that's included in what I made here. And I'm not going to provide measurements because I think you'll want to make yours to the size that best fits your box because they'll be different than mine. You'll just want to make it look pleasing to the dimensions of your box, similar to what I'm doing here. I also just want to note, if you're planning to fiberglass this box like I will later in this video, you might want to wait to add any of this trim work until after you fiberglass the outside of the box. In my experience, it ends up becoming a lot harder to fiberglass around all of this trim work, whereas if you have just essentially a blank box, you might have a better experience of applying it and waterproofing the box itself before applying all this trim work. Now what I'm cutting here are some really thin strips that will be applied to the lid, and it's really just for the looks of it, but I do think it might provide some rigidity, so it's not just a 1/4 inch panel across the entire top. So if these boxes are stacked or something is set on top of these, there is some level of additional support than just 1/4 inch plywood and fiberglass. And after cutting everything to dimension, I'm just rounding over the corners ahead of time to make my life easier once they're applied to the box. Here's the lineup of trim work I'm using for 2 boxes. So there's 8 long sticks with 1 roundover on one side, 8 short sticks with the same roundover. This will be for the gasket. There are 10 of these thinner blocks for the lid, and 8 blocks of the same depth as the gasket blocks, but will be for the latches and hinges. So now that we have all the trim work created, we can start applying it to our box. And so I'm just taking these sticks with the rounded edge facing away from the opening of the box and sticking them on the edges as a starting point for applying the longer edge. And so I'll butt one side up to the side of the stick and then take a pencil and mark off how long it is and make that cut. Doing it this way saves you from having to measure every piece, and it usually results in a perfect fit. Now I'm just applying this trim with some glue and brads, and you'll see I'll leave a 5/16 gap from the top of the box to the top of the trim work, and that's just to have space for the gasket later on. And we just repeat the same process for the other side of the box and then also for the other box. And here's a shot to show how the lid will come down to prevent water intrusion from coming into the box when the lid is closed. Now I'm just applying the same trim to the lid, but I don't want the spacer to be below the lid. I want it to be above so that when the box closes, it's a watertight seal. And then I'm applying the end pieces to the lid, but not to the box at this time. And now I'm just adding these little pieces of trim to the lid of the box, primarily just for the look of it, but there is some level of functionality to these where it will keep straps from slipping off if they're strapped down, and I do think it provides additional rigidity to the top of the box in case they're stacked. So the reason we didn't put that trim piece on this lower section is because I want to include a space for a handle. And I'm using this rope style handle that you find on a lot of coolers. And I want to recess that into the box. So what I'm gluing up here is essentially the back of that recess for those handles. And they'll be recessed back about a ½ inch. Which is what I'm gluing on here, is the sides of that recess that pushes these back by about a ½ inch. And you can see that on the side of these side pieces, there's a 45-degree angle, because remembering back to part 1, the frame of these boxes are actually cut at 45-degree angles inside the box. So this will allow these pieces to slide all the way down to the bottom without interfering with those frame pieces. Now I'm gluing these on scrap pieces of plywood, so the next step is to cut these out, and I'm making 4 of them because I have 2 for each box. So the next step is to cut the actual hole for the recess, and I'm using a router with a simple rectangle jig that I threw together with some scrap wood to cut out that rectangle shape. The shape leaves about 1.5 inches at the top of the box, but then goes all the way down to the bottom of the box so that the recess is continuous all the way down. And just a quick check to make sure the piece we made fits the hole well. And since it does, I'll just take that piece and attach it with some glue and brads. The recess piece fills in 3 of the 4 sides, but we do need to add in this 4th piece to the top to cover that hole and give us some material to work with when we're applying the actual handles later on in the process. And just like the rest of the trim work, I'm taking a quick moment to round over all the edges with a 3/4 inch round over bit on my router. If you don't have one, you could just use sandpaper here. It would just take a bit longer. Now that we're done with the recesses, we can finally add the last pieces of the gasket trim work. And I didn't show this here, but on the table saw, I just nibbled away at the center of this to give about a 1/4 inch to a ½ inch gap between that trim piece and the box. And what that will eventually allow for is a place to add straps if you wanted to strap the box down and still have access to the inside with the lid opening up. Now, like I showed earlier, we're using a rope style handle here that you might find on a lot of coolers, and that requires 2 different holes to be drilled out here that the rope then can be run through and tied off inside to support that handle. This first set of holes are a ½ inch, and this will be the size that the rope runs through, and they go all the way through that piece of wood. You can see it coming out the bottom there, and I'll do that on both sides. And you can see once the rope is passed through the hole and tied with a simple knot, it's very strong and will not pass through. The issue is now we have this large knot sitting on top of the box. So I'm drilling a second hole that will help recess the knot further into the box so it's not interfering with the lid. Now the second set of holes I'll drill is using a Forstner bit, and I'm applying this scrap piece of wood to have additional support for my drill, and I'm trying to drill out essentially a half circle here that allows the knot to tuck into it. And you can see that my goal is not to go past that 1/4 inch Lauan on the outside of the box. When I take that scrap piece off, it leaves a perfect half circle that the knot can then nest into and stay out of the way. So now that we finished the short side of the box, it's time to work on the long side. And if you remember back, we made 8 of these pieces with 2 rounded over sides. And these will be supports for the latches and the hinges. And I'm adding 2 to either side of the box for the latches and hinges. These are oversized, obviously, and so I'm going to cut them down. And I decided to cut these at a 45-degree angle too, just to be more pleasing to my eye and kind of mimic the same chamfers we have on the box. Now I'm applying these trim pieces to be in line with the furthest out trim pieces on the lid so that there's some continuity around the entire box. And I'm not really taking measurements here, but I'm using my square to take that initial measurement off the lid and applying it to the side of the box so I know where to place the trim piece. And I'll just attach those with some glue and some brad nails. And the final step before moving on to fiberglassing is just to make a recess for the hinges that will provide room for the gasket later on. And I'm only cutting this recess into the lower side of the box that you see here, not the lid. And at this point of the process, this is essentially the finished shape of the box. If you wanted to add more embellishments or trim work, you could do so, but this is where I decided to stop. The next step is to really just go in and fill more holes and gaps that were left behind in the trim work, from rounded corners hitting the trim. You can see here there's one big spot that has to be filled, and just going around and filling all those in and sanding off the edges so they're nice and rounded. I'll also use the same body filler for a little bit of a fillet in these 90-degree angles for some added strength and better water runoff. Now, I am by no means a fiberglassing expert. I'm barely a novice here. So I did some research and found that 8 harness weaves are supposed to flex and bend better around corners. So that's what I bought, an 8 harness, 8-ounce satin weave. And I decided to run a test piece to see how it would lay over a piece with a lot of different angles. So you can see here I have a couple different pieces here. I've got a nice 90-degree angle with some thicker pieces, and then the shallower piece that's similar to what's on top of the box. And I got a bunch of bubbles and wrinkles and folds, and it just would not lay into the corners like I thought it should. And so in the end, I decided not to lay fiberglass on the outside of the box, but rather just on the inside where there's less angles to deal with. And if it were to bubble or wrinkle, I wouldn't have to see that on the outside. Now, I know a workaround exists for this, so if you're familiar with a better way of doing this, let me know down in the comments on what you might have done differently or purchased differently than what I'm using here. I'm using Total Boat's polyester finishing resin. If you're going to do this with a polyester resin, I would recommend you use a finishing resin because a laminating resin will never really set up. It's always tacky. It's meant to apply additional layers to. So if you do use a polyester resin, make sure it says finishing resin. I pre-cut all my fiberglass before mixing any resin, only because once you start mixing resin, things tend to get a bit messy and I don't want frayed edges if at all possible. And throughout this entire process, I made 3-ounce batches of resin at a time for 2 reasons. One, being new to this, I didn't want it to start setting up on me while I'm still working with it, so I wanted to work in small batches at a time and didn't want to waste the product. And the second reason are the solo cups. They're not ideal for mixing resin because it starts to melt the plastic after about 10 or 15 minutes, but it's all I had on hand, so I was just mixing 3 ounces at a time, and when I was running out, I would just set the cup aside and get a new fresh cup and a fresh batch of resin each time. In the end, all 6 sides of the inside of the box are fiberglass and resined, which just ensures that it's watertight from every angle. Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you like this type of content, please subscribe and leave a comment down below on your thoughts of this build so far, or maybe advice on my fiberglassing skills. I know there's a lot of room for improvement there. In the next episode, I'll take these boxes through the finishing touches, sanding, priming, painting, and applying all the last little details to get these boxes watertight. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching Maker's Revival. Some boxes to go camping. Maybe you have a new rig. Let's start that again because the world's loudest truck is driving by. Congratulations.